Hello everyone, thanks for joining me again today. We're going to pick up where we left off here, going through Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. The beginning, Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The beginning of this book is pretty grim. The preacher, the son of David, the king of Jerusalem himself, says that all is vanity of vanities. He asks what profit a man's work is. This must surely figure into the rest of the book, but for now we see that he's taking a pretty dark view, saying that there is no benefit to hard work under the sun. It's meant to provide for us and that's it. Is that all there is to life? He goes on to discuss how generations come and go, but the earth stays forever. The sun rises and sets and seems to go back to where it rose from in our estimation. The wind whirls in a constant circuit of north to south and back. All the rivers run into the sea, which is not full, and then they go back again. He says that everything is full of labor and man can't utter it. The eye and ear are not satisfied or filled with seeing or hearing. Notice that the work of these things is an automatic returning work. Everything seems to have its labor, which it is part of what makes it the way that it is, and then it has labor to return to its original state. He uses these things as an analogy for our work. We work to change things, and then we work to put them back the way they were. And what benefit is taken from it that we should make it the sum and substance of our lives? Everything is the way it was and will be the way it is. The preacher says that there is nothing new under the sun and challenges anyone to say that something is new, to which he already prepares a reply. It hath been already of old time which was before us. There is no memory of former things, nor shall there be any memory of things that are to come when those things with those who come later. What new things do we do in our labor, and what legacy do we actually leave behind? Can our legacies last? The preacher then gives some clues to who he is, as well as talking about his own part in this book. He was king of Israel in Jerusalem. He gave himself to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven, since travail was given by God to us to be exercised by it. Sore travail was given by God to us to be exercised by it. He saw all the works done under the sun, and he considers them vanity and vexation of spirit. He says what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is in lack cannot be multiplied. He says to himself that he has a great estate and great wisdom beyond anyone else, and he gives himself to know wisdom, madness, and folly, but now he perceives that his work in these matters is also vexation of spirit, because in much wisdom is much grief, and whoever increases knowledge increases sorrow. Truly he makes the case that ignorance is bliss, and this tells us why he's taking this position. He's looking for something worth his time and effort, worth all of our time and effort on earth, but notice that he doesn't mention God yet. God isn't included in this. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. In this chapter, Solomon, whom I believe the book has already established it by its clues as its writer, talks about how he has set out to enjoy mirth and pleasure, but he found that it was vanity. He said that laughter is mad and asked what mirth is good for. He gives himself everything that he wanted: wine, wisdom, folly, great works, horses, vineyards, gardens and orchards, pools of water, servants and cattle, silver and gold, singers, delights of all kinds. He was great and increased. He didn't keep anything from his own eyes or withhold his heart from any joy. All of this to see what was good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven of all of the days of their life. Where did it lead? He looked on everything he had done and saw that it was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no actual profit of it under the sun. Why? Well, if we go back to chapter 1, we have that answer. None of it is new, none of it produces a legacy forever, none of it can do anything better for the man. None of it builds men up any better than they already are. He then turns to see wisdom and madness and folly and asks what a man can do after the king, to which he answers, even that which has already been done. Wisdom excels folly like light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. But this is when he turns it around. One event happens to them all. Not even the wisest man in the world could escape the same fate that the wise and the fools suffer. Why then was Solomon more wise? This was also vanity. He says that there is no remembrance of the wise man forever more than the fool. What is now is forgotten in the days to come, and the wise man dies like the fool dies. This is when we see something truly sad. Solomon hated life because all work was grievous to him, because all is vanity and vexation of spirit. He then goes on to say that he hated everything that he did because he would just end up leaving it to someone else who knew whether the one who would profit from his work would be wise or foolish. Yet some other man would have rule over everything that Solomon did and show himself wise. He says this is vanity. He then chose to despair of all his labors. He says that a man with Wise and knowledgeable and equitable labor will end up leaving his work and his profit to a man who didn't work for it. He calls this vanity and a great evil. What does a man have of all that he does and all he puts himself through? He says that all of a man's days are sorrows and his travail grief. His heart doesn't rest in the night, and Solomon says that this is also vanity. He's saying that because a man doesn't get to enjoy all the reward of his labors himself, but eventually will leave those benefits to someone else that he doesn't know will be either a wise man or a fool, it's all meaningless and vexes the spirit. To end this chapter, Solomon says that the best life can offer us is to eat and drink and enjoy the good our work does. Of course, he says that all of this comes from the hand of God. God is the one who blesses us in this life, not our own efforts alone. He says that nobody can eat or make haste to that more than himself, and says that God gives to a man who is good in his sight wisdom, knowledge, and joy, but to the sinner he gives hard times to gather and heap up, and to give to he who is good before God. The ending for the sinner is vanity and vexation of spirit. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Solomon goes on to say that there is a time and a season to everything. He mentions some opposites: birth and death, planting and reaping, killing and healing, breaking and building, weeping and laughing, mourning and dancing, casting stones and gathering stones, embracing and refraining, getting and losing, keeping and throwing away, ripping and sewing, silence and speaking, love and hate, war and peace. He asks then, what profit does the one who works have in his labor? Everything has its time and season, so what profit is there in work, either in the season or out of it? They get something that they have to replace in a sense, and replace what they have to get in a sense. What actual profit is there? Why should we make any of this our lives? He then goes on to say, that God makes everything beautiful in its time. This goes back to talking about how there is a time for everything. There's a time for everything to be made beautiful. He set the world in our hearts so we can't find out the works that God has made from the beginning to the end. This doesn't negate the work of science or any other work. It means that we can't understand the work of God from the beginning, which is too far back for us to truly know for a fact, to the end, which comes long after we're gone. He goes on to say that the only real good that there is in this world is in our experiences, to rejoice and to do good in our lives, to eat and drink and enjoy the good of our labor, as that is the gift God gives to us in this life alone. Whatever God does is forever. Nothing can be added to it or taken from it, and God does it for man to fear before him. What is once was, and what will be now is, and God demands of that which is past its due. God always repays in the future what has happened in the past. Solomon goes on to see the place of judgment and righteousness, that wickedness and iniquity are there. God judges the righteous and the wicked, and there is a time for every purpose and work. These places are not like God. God judges justly, even though we may be wicked and sinful in our judgments. The righteous and the wicked are both judged by God. Concerning our estates, he writes that God will make them known, and we might see that we ourselves are beasts. What happens to us also happens to beasts. We all die. We have no preeminence above a beast, because all is vanity. All go to one place, all are of the dust, and to all turn to dust again. He asks who knows the spirit of man which goes upward to God, and the spirit of the beast which goes down into the earth. He then says that, well, that's why there is nothing better for a man to find joy in his own work than for a man to find joy in his own works. That is what God has given us. Who will bring us to see what will be after we die? Why should we worry about the future when we can enjoy what the Lord has given us now? We shouldn't bank on the future. We should bank on what the Lord has given us now and no more. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Now Solomon talks about something that Job could sympathize with, and sometimes that we've all experienced. It's not about the most inspiring topic to talk about, but Solomon is talking about what is rather than what will be. He says that he considered all of the oppression under the sun, and that those who were oppressed and wept had no comforter, and their oppressor had power, but they had no comforter. For this reason he praised the dead who were already dead and didn't have to suffer any more than the living who are yet alive and can still suffer. Even more so, he says that the one who is unborn is more blessed than those who have either died or still live, because he doesn't see the evil work that is done under the sun. Solomon then gives us a little wisdom. He says that all travail and every right work which leads to the envy of our neighbors is all vanity and vexation of spirit. This, I believe, is in regard to the envy of the neighbors. Solomon has already talked about how doing good and taking joy in one's work on earth is a gift from God. He says the fool folds his hands together and eats his own flesh, or that the fool is lazy and doesn't receive what he needs for it, so rather than working when he should, he's left to scramble when he's in need. He goes on to say that it's better to have a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. It's good to work for what you need, but it's better to have only one handful of what you need and be content than to have both hands full of what you need and have worked hard and stressed yourself out for it. Solomon then gives us another example of the exact opposite. He sees vanity in the one who's alone and still never stops working, never stops pushing forward, never is satisfied, nor wonders who his labor is for and why he works himself so hard that it bereaves his soul of good. He says this is vanity and a sore travail. It's not good to be lazy, but it's also not good to be so driven that you keep struggling and pushing and working and have no reason to keep working yourself to death and don't enjoy your work or its fruits or do good. Solomon goes on from this point about the lonely workaholic to talk about how it is good to have company. Like a famous man once wrote, "No man is an island unto himself." So too does he say that two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. If one falls, the other will help him up, but what happens if one falls alone? He has to get up alone. If two lie together, they can keep warm. Not so easy for just one man alone. Further, if someone is prevailing against you, having two together means you have some help, and a band of 3 cords is not easily broken. It's good to have others around you with whom you can struggle and celebrate. Solomon then says that a poor and wise child is better than an old and foolish king who refuses to listen to others. Out of a sort of prison that old foolish king comes to reign. He who is born in the kingdom, the child, becomes poor due to the foolishness of the old king. He considers everyone alive with the second child that will come up in the future of that kingdom. He says there is no end to all the people, or all that have been before them, and those who come afterward will not rejoice in the old foolish king. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. Therefore, whether young or old, being foolish and refusing to listen to reason is vanity and vexation of spirit, whereas being wise, even if you're a child, is a gift from God. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Now Solomon gives some wise instruction for coming before God in his place. He also makes dreams something of a theme here. He says to watch our steps and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, because fools don't consider that they do evil. So we should learn good from evil by what words are spoken of in the house of the Lord, and watch what we do. Fools don't watch what they do, and they don't listen to anyone but themselves. He warns us to not be rash with our mouths or hasty to utter anything before God. God is in heaven, and we are on earth, so we should make our words few. He says that a dream comes through a lot of busyness of mind, and a fool's voice is known through much talk. When we vow a vow to God, we should do everything we can to pay it. God has no pleasure in fools who take the name of the Lord in vain, so we must pay what we've vowed. It's better that we should not vow at all, like Christ said, letting our yes be yes and our no be no, than to vow and not pay. He warns us to not let our mouth cause us to sin, nor say to an angel that it was an error, and asks why we should make God angry at our voice and destroy what we do. In many dreams and words there are diverse vanities, but we must fear God. That this is part of the vanity that Solomon has been talking about, and he's been trying to get us to realize that we should do good and rejoice in the work of our hands. Most of all, we should be people of our word and trust and obey the Lord always, and not be slack to do the work of the Lord. Solomon reminds us that we shouldn't marvel at the oppression of the poor or the violent perversion of judgment anywhere, because there is one higher than the judges, and he, the higher than the highest, regards all. God will bring to us all what we deserve in due time, and nobody escapes his judgment. Solomon then brings up the vanity and sore evil of laboring just to get rich. He says that the profit of the earth is for everyone, because even the king is served his food by the field. Those who love money or prosperity are not satisfied by the things they love, which is vanity. When goods increase, those who eat them increase as well, and he asks what good there is to those who own those goods, except that they should look at them. He reminds us that the sleep of a working man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the riches of the rich won't let him sleep. The sore evil that Solomon has seen under the sun in this case is riches kept from their owners for their owners to their hurt. Those riches perish by evil travail, and the formerly rich man who has a son can give him nothing. We all came into this world a certain way, and in that same way we will leave this world. We can't even bring our clothing with us, let alone our riches. What profit do we have if we labor as for the wind, which means just to get rich? The rich always eat in darkness and have much sorrow and wrath with their sickness as well. Being rich is a curse, and too many people who want to be rich don't realize it, and those who are rich are already trapped in it. Solomon concludes this chapter by saying that it is good and comely for us to eat and drink and enjoy the good of our labor for our lives, all of which God gives us as our portion. Everyone to whom God gives riches and wealth and gives power to eat thereof and take the portion and have their joy in their labor, all of this is the gift from God, of God. We don't remember the days of our lives much because God answers us in the joy of His heart and ours. Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Solomon actually says something that God provides is evil and a disease. He says that it's an evil disease when God gives someone great riches and wealth and honor to want nothing that he could desire, but God doesn't let him enjoy it, but a total stranger gets it. Not even someone who the person knows, but a stranger. This may be one of God's punishments on someone. There are things that God does that we can't understand, and things that God does that He explains to us. In truth, we can never understand anything about God that He doesn't reveal. Nonetheless, this is potentially a punishment for God to give someone prosperity and the inability to enjoy it and have a stranger enjoy it instead. Solomon then says that a man who has a lot of children and lives for a long time, if his soul is not filled with good and he doesn't even get buried, is an untimely birth is better off than he is. He comes in with vanity, with the appearance of something good that is shallow and meaningless, and goes in darkness, and his name is covered in darkness. This is talking about the untimely birth. Moreover, he doesn't see the sun or know anything, so he has more rest than the man in this example. Though he lives 2,000 years, if a man has not seen any good, then the only question is whether or not all go to one place. We all die. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not forever satisfied, which means that all the work is for nothing if you don't enjoy the fruits of your labors. What has the wise man more than the fool? What about the poor that knows to walk before the living? No matter what a man may have, if it does him no good, it does him no good if he doesn't do good and enjoy it in this life, which means that it goes to waste otherwise. Solomon says that it's better to see than for desire to wander, because the wandering of desire is vanity and vexation of spirit. What has been named is named already. It is man. Man cannot contend with God, who is mightier than man. Solomon ends this chapter on a dark note. There are many things that increase vanity, so what is man the better for any of them? Who knows what is good for us in this life, all the days of our vain lives, which we spend as a shadow? Who can tell us what will be after our deaths under the sun? We should enjoy what God has given us and work to do good. That is all a gift from God. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Solomon says that a good name is better than precious ointment, which sounds good, but then it takes a dark turn when he says that the days of one's death is better than the day of their birth. This is because of the travail and vanity of life, and death being a rest from it, whereas the day of birth is the beginning of this travail. Notice this next part. Solomon says that it is better to mourn than to be joyful, because the end of all men is to mourn, and the living will lay it to his heart. He goes on to say that sorrow is better than laughter, because by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. It's better to let yourself be sad and sorrowful than to make yourself happy, because then you can get it all out and heal from your sorrows. He says that the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Fools seek to be happy all the time, while the wise can't help but mourn. He says it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than to learn from something that stings than to hear the song of fools in their happiness. The laughter of a fool is vanity, and that's the crackling of the thorns under a pot. What he's saying here is that ignorance is bliss, and wisdom shows us everything that has gone wrong since the original sin. He then gives us some advice. Oppression makes the wise crazy, and a gift destroys the heart. The end of things is better than the beginning, and the patient are better than the proud. He says we should not get angry quickly, because anger is a quality of fools. He says we shouldn't ask why things were so much better in the past, because that is not wise inquiry. Things weren't really better in the past. We just tend to remember good things from the past more than bad things. Then Solomon goes into some instruction on seeking to be wise and good over being foolish and evil. He says that wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to us. Wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it, which makes wisdom better than money. Who can make straight what God has made crooked? Consider the works of God. He advises us to be joyful in the day of prosperity, but to consider in the day of adversity that God set the one against the other, to the end that we should find nothing after our lives are over. He goes on to say that there are just men who die in their righteousness, and wicked men who live longer by their wickedness. He warns us to not be too righteous or wise, so we don't destroy ourselves by our attempts at righteousness and wisdom, because we can never be completely righteous or wise. He then warns us to not be wicked or foolish, so we don't die before our time. He says we should take hold of this and not withdraw our hand, that he who fears God will come forth of them all. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 mighty men. He is built up to this point. There is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. We should not eavesdrop on conversations, or we'll hear our servants curse us. Often we have also cursed others in the same way, so Solomon teaches us. Let's remember this next part. Solomon has proven all of this by wisdom, and has desired to be wise, but what is far from him? That which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can discover it? He was driven to know, search, and seek out wisdom, for the reasons for things, and to know the wickedness of folly, foolishness, and madness. He says that a woman whose heart is snares and nets and hands are like bands is more bitter than death. Those who please God escape from her, but the sinner is taken by her. He has found this, counting one by one to find out the account. His soul sought it out, but couldn't find it. 1 man among 1,000 he found, but not a woman among them. These are among those who please God. He then says that he has only found this, of everything that he says about men and women. God made man upright, but we have sought out many inventions. We have looked for ways to be unrighteous and sinful. Solomon's words against women may come from his experience with his wives, but his experiences with man come, at least in part, from himself. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. This time Solomon has words about wisdom in kings. He says that the wise man who knows the interpretation of a thing makes his face to shine, and his boldness shall be changed. He doesn't make himself look angry or hard-hearted. Rather, he makes his face as appealing as possible. He counsels that we should keep the king's commandment in regard of the oath of God. We should not rush to leave the king's sight or stand in an evil thing because the king does whatever he wants. The word of a king has power, and nobody can ask him what he's doing. He says that those who keep the commandment will feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. This is all in connection to obeying and appealing to a king, being humble in front of him rather than exalting ourselves before him. Now Solomon goes on to a little more about the nature of evil. Every purpose has a time and judgment, and that's why the misery of man is great on him. We all like to think we can control the time, but we can't. We don't know the future, and who can tell us when or how it will be? None of us have power over our spirit to retain it, neither do we have power in the day of death, and there is no discharge in that war, nor shall wickedness deliver those who are given to it. Solomon has seen all of this, and applied his heart to every work done under the sun. There is a time when a man rules over another to his own hurt. Sometimes ruling over another person can be to your disadvantage. Solomon says that he saw the wicked who had come and gone from this place of the holy, forgotten in the city when they had so done wickedly. Doing this wickedness is also vanity, because the wicked all die, and eventually all are forgotten. He says that though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days be prolonged, it will still be well with them that fear before God. It will not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. He goes on to talk about a vanity done on the earth. There are just men who suffer the fate of the wicked, and there are wicked men who enjoy the end of the righteous, and that is vanity. This is when he says that he commends mirth, because man has nothing better on this earth than to eat and drink and be merry, because that will stay with us of our labor for all the days of our lives which God gives us in this life. We remember what he said about foolishness being all about mirth, and joy and wisdom being about mourning, but we also remember that he said not be overly wise or righteous, nor overly sinful or foolish. He also said that there is a time for everything under heaven. Let's remember that in light of this passage. Solomon ends this chapter by saying that he applied his heart to know wisdom and to see what is done on the earth, because there is someone who doesn't see sleep day or night. Then he saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though we may try as hard as we can to seek it out, or though a wise man think to know it, none of us will be able to find it. God's work is beyond our knowledge or wisdom, and only what he has revealed can be known about his work or himself. Some of this is revealed through general revelation of creation itself, through science, but most of it is revealed clearly through the Bible's books. Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Solomon goes on to say that he had considered the righteous and wise, and their works are in the hand of God. No man knows either love or hatred by all that is before him. We only know love and hatred by the hand of God. All things come alike to everyone. There is one event that comes to the righteous and the wicked, to the clean and the unclean, to those who sacrifice and those who do not, to the good and the sinner, to the swearer and those who fear oaths. He says this is an evil among us, among all that is done, that all of us die under the same circumstances. He says that the heart of all of us, the sons of men, is full of evil, and madness is in our hearts while we live, and afterward we all go to the dead. He says that those who do what God commands end up dying just like those who don't. Why does everyone die? Because we all have evil and madness in us. This is the reason for this evil. Solomon then goes on to talk about the dead on earth. He says that those who join to the living have hope, because a live dog is better than a dead lion. The living know that they will die, but the dead don't know anything, nor have a reward, because their memory is forgotten. Their love, their hatred, their envy is all gone now, nor do they have any more a portion ever in what is done on earth. From the view of this life, the dead have nothing, know nothing, and are nothing. That doesn't mean that the state of the dead is this way from another perspective, say, one big enough to encompass all things like God's, nor does it mean anything about our souls or spirits. Solomon encourages us to eat with joy and drink with a merry heart, and says that God accepts our works. He encourages us to let our garments always be white and our head lack no ointment. He encourages us to live joyfully with our wives all the days of our lives of our vanity that God has given us under the sun, all the days of our vanity, because this is our portion in life, and in the labor which we take under the sun. Whatever we find to do, he encourages us to do it with all our might, because there is nothing in the grave where we go. Solomon then tells us that all things are left up to chance and luck. He says that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, or riches to the understanding, nor favor to skillful men, but time and chance happen to us all. We don't know when we'll die. Like fish caught in an evil net and birds caught in a snare, so are we snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly on us. None of us know when we will die, and nothing that we do is to our greatness in any measure, but time and chance deliver it to us. Solomon goes on to say that he has seen wisdom that seemed great to him. His analogy is of a little city with few men, against whom a great king came and besieged it and built bulwarks against it. And it was a poor yet wise man, and his wisdom saved the city, but nobody remembered him.
Have you tried these?
No, go on.
They're for tomorrow.
Okay.
Tell your girlfriends about it. They might sleep with you.
That was my brother. Okay, where was I? Then Solomon said that wisdom is better than strength, but the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words unheard. The words of wise men are heard in quiet, more than in the cry of the ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner can destroy much good. Sinners are the weakness of any society, and wisdom can do more good than any powerful weapon. Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Here Solomon gets into more proverbs that are provided to further support his points. As dead flies cause ointment to stink, so does a little folly in one who is reputed wise and honorable. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, where God puts it, and which is the hand of gain, while a fool's is in the wrong place, on the left, which is the hand of loss. A fool loses his wisdom as he walks, and tells everyone just what a fool he is. If a ruler rises up against you, don't leave your place, because yielding pacifies great offenses. He says there is an evil he has seen, an error that proceeds from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, and the rich sit in lowly places. Servants are on horses, and princes walk like servants. Whoever does something evil will suffer for their deeds, like falling into a pit you dig, and being bitten by a serpent in a hedge you broke up. Whatever you set your hand to do is how you will be hurt, especially when it's evil. Those who remove stones will be hurt by them, and those who chop wood will be endangered by it. Wisdom is profitable to direct, much like having a sharpened edge on an axe used to chop wood, because the iron is blunt and the edge is not whetted. You must put more strength to the task. The serpent bites without enchantment, and a babbler is just as bad, talking without anyone, asking his opinion. The words of the wise are gracious, but a fool's lips will swallow him up. The beginning of the words of a fool's mouth is in foolishness, and the end of his talk is mischievous madness. A fool is also full of words. A man can't tell what will be, and who knows what will come after him. The labor of the fool makes them all weary, because they don't know to go to the city and seek help. Solomon then pronounces woe on the land where a king is a child, and princes eat in the morning before the work is done. This is because it's generally true that children don't have the knowledge or wisdom to rule, and a man should eat what he gets from his work. Solomon goes on to say that by laziness the building decays, and through the idle hands the house drops through. It's good to do work, because it's by doing your own work that you get what you need for life and keep what you use in good shape. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes people happy, but money is an answer to all things. In this fallen, sinful world, everyone seems to have a price, and money buys just about everything. Solomon doesn't say whether this is good or bad, because money is a tool and should be used as such, not as the goal for life, as Solomon pointed out before, and not as the meaning of one's life, which Solomon also pointed out before, but as a mere tool to help you along. He ends this chapter warning against cursing kings and the rich, whether in thought or in private, because it'll be like a bird carrying the voice and telling the matter. Such words spread fast, far, and wide, and are more trouble than they're worth. Ecclesiastes chapter 11. This time Solomon advises to cast our bread on the waters, and we will find it after many days. This tells us to give our bread to others, and we will find our own after many days. We know this because the next verse says to give a portion to 7 or 8, because we don't know what evil will come on the earth. The full clouds empty themselves on the earth, and the falling tree will be found laying in the direction in which it fell. God provides for us through nature, and all things happen according to the pattern that has been set for them. Those who observe the wind refuse to sow, and those who regard the clouds refuse to reap. This tells us both to be careful to prepare for the wind when we sow and the clouds when we reap, and to do our work in all times, or we will have nothing to show for ourselves. We don't know the way of the Spirit, nor do we know how the bones grow in the womb of the pregnant woman, nor do we know the works of God who made everything. He advises us to sow our seed in the morning and not withhold our hands in the evening, because we don't know whether what we do will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. We should do our best and leave the rest to God and His plans, which we can't know anything about unless He reveals it to us. Solomon tells us that the light is sweet and it's pleasant to behold the sun, but if we live many years and rejoice in them all, we should remember the days of darkness, which shall be for many years. All that comes is vanity. None of it has meaning. He then ends the chapter by saying that the young man should rejoice and let his heart cheer him in the days of his youth, and walk in the ways of his heart and in the sight of his eyes, while still knowing that for all these things God will bring the young man into judgment. We should enjoy our youth while we're young, but we should be careful to not sin, as God will bring us into judgment. He then advises that the young man remove sorrow from his heart and put away evil from his flesh, because childhood and youth are vanity. The days of our youth are without meaning and meant to be enjoyed in their carefree nature, but we should be careful to put evil away from us before we go after what we're drawn to, even in our youth, because God will judge us for everything that we've done, including what we've done in our youth. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Here Solomon gives advice for a whole lifetime, but there's also a bit of an apocryphal tone to some of this, contrasting the end of man's life with the end of the world. Remember God who created us in our youth before the evil days and years when we will say that we have no pleasure in them. He advises us to remember God while the sun, the light, the moon, and stars are not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men bow themselves because of weight, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors are shut in the streets, when grinding is low, and he rises up at the voice of the bird, and the daughters of music are brought low, also when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears are in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails, because man goes to the grave, and the mourners go about the streets. He goes on to say, or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl broken, or the pitcher broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, referring both to the end of the world and the end of our lives, and the spirit shall return to God who gave it. We all return to God after we die, just like Solomon was talking about how our spirits go up to God and the spirits of the animals go down into the earth. Solomon says that all things are vanity, and because he was wise he still taught the people knowledge, gave good heed, sought out and set in order proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth. He compares the words of the wise to goads and nails, fashioned by the masters of assembling, which are given from one shepherd. That shepherd is Christ. Further, by these he says to his son to be admonished. He says there is no end to making many books, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Who else would know that better than Solomon? Still, wise words are a foundation that is sure, and a lot hangs on them. That's why it's good to teach people knowledge and wisdom and set out to find such things and study them. Finally, Solomon writes that the conclusion of the whole matter is to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, because God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. We will already know that this will happen at the last judgment, which is in part why I believe this last chapter was talking about the end times. But also God sometimes brings things to light before them, or at a person's death, or after their death. Therefore let us fear God and keep his commandments. This is the good and wisdom that Solomon advises us to do in the work of our hands, in which we should rejoice and find joy, because everything else is ultimately vanity. Song of Solomon 1. This book is considered by many scholars to be a beautiful statement about Christ and his church, with the church being his bride. Some of these statements are beautiful expressions of love for us all. Solomon wrote this to one of his wives, but it fits the love of the Father for Israel and the love of Christ for the church. Solomon writes both from his own perspective and from that of his bride. He says that his love is better than wine, and God's love truly is better than anything wine can do for us. He says that his name is as ointment poured forth, so the virgins love him, and so it is with Christ and with the church. His ointment is good, and his name is like ointment poured forth. The church is supposed to be a virginal bride for Christ. This verse about entering the king's chambers and rejoicing and remembering the king's love more than wine, because the upright love the king. How can this not be talking about Christ, his love for us, and our love for him? Notice what the next couple of verses say. Here we see a look at the standard of beauty in Israel during Solomon's reign and how it was changing. Black skin was considered to be unattractive, but that was changing, especially considering that Solomon's wife in this book is black. She is as the tents of Kedar, or the curtains of Solomon. She says to not look at her for being black because of the sun looking on her. She doesn't want the color of her skin to be either what makes her beloved or what makes her unattractive to her husband, which we can see is actually the opposite. I dare say she's more attractive to him for her skin. She goes on into her account of how her siblings were angry with her and made her keep their vineyards, which took her away from her ability to care for her own. She is treated like the least of her siblings by them, expected to work for them and not take care of her own needs. Solomon then writes that he should tell her where he feeds, and where his flocks rest at noon, because she should not be as one who turns aside by the flocks of companions. His soul loves her, and her soul loves him, and she will go after nobody else. See her faithfulness, and how faithful we should be to God. Then Solomon, who calls her the fairest among women, tells her to go by the footsteps of her flock and feed the kids beside the shepherd's tents. We have work to do on earth while Christ is in heaven, and we are expected to keep doing our work with the help of our local congregations and elders and deacons. Solomon then compares his love to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots, a sign of great beauty. He goes on to talk about how beautiful she is with rows of jewels and chains of gold, and how he will make her borders of gold with studs of silver. This reminds us of how Christ will bring us a new white wardrobe to wear and a new name that nobody else will know. This next part is a discourse on how much the wife loves her husband, how he's like a bundle of myrrh, a cluster of camphor in the vineyards of En-gedi, how he is fair and has dove's eyes, how pleasant they are, and how beautiful their place is, with its green bed and beams and rafters of cedar and fir. How beautiful is heaven going to be for us, and how close will we be to Christ when we get there. Song of Solomon, chapter 2. Listen to how each describes the other, and how these descriptions flow seamlessly into each other. Solomon is described as the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valley, and his wife like a lily among thorns. Solomon is described as an apple tree among the trees of the wood, providing something of value among trees that don't necessarily provide. The woman sits under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit is sweet to her taste. He brought her to the banqueting house, and his banner over her was love. One of the prevailing images we get of our relationship to Christ is that of the great marriage supper, where Christ will have his church sitting with him to enjoy the supper. She pleads with him to stay her with flagons and comfort her with apples because she's lovesick. He uses his left hand to cradle her head, and his right hand embraces her. She then charges the daughters of Jerusalem by rows and hinds to not stir up or awaken Solomon until he pleases. She doesn't want him to lose any sleep because of them, because she loves him that much. She goes on to say that she hears the voice of her beloved leaping on the mountains and skipping on hills. He's like a roe or young hart, standing behind the wall and looking through windows, showing himself at the lattice. This reminds us of how Christ says that he stands at the door of our hearts and knocks, and if we answer and let him in, he will eat with us and we with him. We then get a look at Solomon speaking to his love. He asks her to rise up and go with him somewhere else. He says that the winter is past and the rain is gone. Flowers are on the earth, songbirds have come, and the turtle can be heard in the land. The fig tree puts forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grape give a good smell. He calls to his beloved to come away. Remember how Christ said that the coming of the end times would be seen like when we know that spring is near, with the fig tree puts forth its leaves? The whole section is Christ calling away his church, not as in a rapture of any sort, but after the tribulation, or that winter which he also spoke of, as in, pray that your flight be not in winter, nor on the Sabbath day. She then goes on to call her beloved her dove in the clefts of the rock and the secret place of the stairs, asking to see his face and hear his voice, because his voice is sweet and his face is comely. She asks that they might take little foxes that spoil the vines, because the vines have tender grapes. Remember when Christ said that he is the vine and we are the branches, and Paul talked about branches being grafted into the vine? She goes on to say that her beloved is hers and she is her beloved's, and he feeds among the lilies. Until the day breaks and the shadows flee away, she asks that he turn and be like a roe or young hart on the mountains of Bether. She asks for him to leap and dance and play and to be with her. Most of all, she wants him near her always. So too does the church cry out for Christ to be near always. Song of Solomon, chapter 3. This next part is about how she wakes up and finds that she's missing her beloved. She leaves her bed, her room, her house, and searches through all the streets for him, even asking the guards on their patrols if they've seen him. He then appears, and she holds him and will not let him go until she brought him into her mother's house and chamber. She then charges the daughters of Jerusalem by the roes and hinds to not stir up or awake her love until he pleases. This is very much like the way that we all seek salvation once we've realized that we've been wrong, and suddenly we come across Christ and our search is then ended. Notice the way that this chapter talks about Solomon and the places where he is, namely his bedroom and chariot. 60 valiant men, experts in war with swords strapped to their thighs, stand guard around Solomon's bed. Solomon's chamber is made with wood from Lebanon, with silver pillars and a golden bottom, covering it with purple. The midst is paved with love for the daughters of Jerusalem. The daughters of Zion are told to go forth and behold King Solomon with the crown of his mother's crowning in the days of his espousal, and the day of the gladness of his heart. Remember the story about the 10 virgins, how they were called to the wedding and 5 had their lamps ready while 5 didn't? Remember how it was a picture of the second coming of Christ? Song of Solomon, chapter 4. This time Solomon speaks, and he attributes to his love some of the qualities that she originally attributed to him, such as having dove's eyes. He speaks of how beautiful she is, and at the end of this particular part of the chapter, he says there is no spot in her. Remember how we were washed so that Christ could present the church to himself without having a spot or wrinkle? He goes on to say that his spouse, whom he calls his sister, is fair, and he has ravished his heart. Remember how we're called the children of God, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ? He goes on to tell her that he wants her to come from Lebanon, to look to the top of Amana, from the top of Shinir and Hermon, from the dens and mountains of lions and leopards. He talks about her beauty, but especially how she is like a garden. Her plants are an orchard with pleasant fruits. Honey and milk is under her tongue. Remember when the promised land was being described with its milk and honey and all of its fruits? He goes on to attribute to her all kinds of spices and herbs: camphor, spikenard, saffron, calamus, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, and aloes, with all the chief spices. Remember that incense was often made with some of these same spices, and the wise men from the east brought Christ gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The woman responds that the winds should blow on her garden for her spices to flow out, and her beloved should come into her garden to eat her pleasant fruits. Remember how the tree of life is in the New Jerusalem, with a different kind of fruit for each month, and leaves that heal the nations. Song of Solomon, chapter 5. The very first verse seems a lot like the wedding supper of the Lamb from the Revelation. Solomon has gathered myrrh with his spice and eaten the honeycomb with the honey. He drank wine with milk. Now he calls his friends to drink and his bride to drink abundantly, as if this was the wedding supper of the Lamb. Then we see a problem. Solomon calls out to his beloved to open the door and let him in, calling her his undefiled. His hair is covered in dew, his coat is off, and he's washed his feet. He's made himself ready to go to her, but when she gets up, her innermost parts moved for him. He's gone. Her soul fails when he speaks. She looks for him everywhere, but can't find him, and he doesn't answer when she calls. The watchmen beat her when they find her. She has the daughters of Jerusalem say, should they find him, that she is lovesick for him. This shows us some possible parallels. One is the short-term parallel of Christ knocking on the door to our hearts and waiting for us to answer. One is a longer-term parallel of Christ coming to the Jews to reach out to them, but they didn't let him in, so he left them, and they were abused by people in authority over them. One is an even longer-term view that Christ comes to us, but by the time that we answer, he is already gone, and we're waiting for him to return. We look for him everywhere, and when we look for him, those in authority over us abuse us while our Lord is not there. Notice how the chapter ends. The daughters of Jerusalem ask what her beloved is more than another, while calling her the fairest among women. They're asking why they should care about her beloved and do her this favor, and asking what makes him so special to her. So too do people ask us the same thing today when we talk about Christ. Many of their questions come around to this one. She then talks about his appearance in beautiful language, among other things about his positive qualities. So too should we talk about all of the positive qualities of Christ when we talk to people. We should, as Peter advises us, always be ready to give an answer to those who ask of our hope with meekness and fear. And as Paul said, we should study to show ourselves approved to God, workers who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. You might notice, by the way, a few of these qualities seem very close to the qualities of Christ in the first chapters of the Revelation. This is no accident. Song of Solomon, chapter 6. Then we see someone asks the woman where her beloved is gone, calling her the fairest among women. They want to help her look for him. He has gone to his garden, to the bed of spices, to feed in the gardens and to gather lilies. She says that she and her beloved belong to each other, and that he feeds among the lilies. What is this garden except for the Garden of Eden, taken out of the world and placed in heaven where Christ is? Who is this woman but the church, asking where Christ is gone, knowing that he has gone back to heaven, his garden? Now notice how Solomon talks about his beloved. Of course, Solomon is writing this about both himself and his beloved, which may indicate that he thinks so highly of both himself and her, or she thinks so highly of him and he knows it, but that's neither here nor there. Rather, we should look at how he describes her beauty and says she is as comely as Jerusalem, terrible as an army with banners. How can one woman be so terrifying? Rather, this is about the church, and Solomon may not even know that he's writing prophecy here, in this work about his beloved and himself. He says her eyes have overcome him. He talks about her hair and teeth, her temples and their locks, and then says that there are 80 queens, 80 concubines, and virgins without number. A score is 20. He says that his beloved is the only one of her mother, choice of she who had borne her. The daughters saw her and blessed her, the queens and concubines, and praised her. Notice that she's described here as an only child. Earlier, she had siblings. This is clearly about the church and how Christ sees us as the church and its members. Again, the woman is compared to an army with banners, fair as the moon and clear as the sun. Solomon goes to the garden of nuts to see the fruits of the valley and whether the vine flourished and the pomegranates budded. His soul made him like the chariots of Aminadab. He calls to her to return as the Shulamite. He asks what he will see in the Shulamite and responds that she is like the company of 2 armies, or Mahanaim. Notice that the image of Christ is looking for signs that the time is near to come back for his bride. He calls to the Shulamite to return and says that she is like an army or even 2 armies. What could cause this comparison except to compare the Shulamite with the church, comprised of both the Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God and our Lord and Savior? Song of Solomon, chapter 7. See how Solomon talks about the beauty of each part of the Shulamite woman's body? We are beautiful to Christ once we are brought into his bride. He compares each part of her body to different beautiful things: jewels, a goblet, wheat set with lilies, rose, an ivory tower, fish pools, another tower at Lebanon, Carmel, purple, and says that the king is held in the galleries. Christ is our king. He says that parts of her are like palm trees and grapes, apples, even the best wine. Christ looks on us with such love and sees in us such beauty thanks to his sacrifice and how he has changed us. The narrative then switches back to the Shulamite's perspective. We are the beloved of Christ who desires us. She calls to Solomon to go into the field and lodge in the villages, to go to the vineyards and see if the vines and pomegranates are producing. And she says that there is where she will give Solomon her loves. She says the mandrakes give a smell, and at our gates are all manner of pleasant fruits, new and old, laid up for her beloved. This sounds like our calling Christ to go with us through the garden of the New Jerusalem. And it also sounds like asking if we, as the branches of the vine, are producing fruit. It's 2 separate illustrations, one of us walking through the garden in the New Jerusalem in which we tell Christ how much we love him, and one is the branches of the vine being watched by Christ and the bride to see if we have borne any fruit. Song of Solomon, chapter 8. Here she wishes that Solomon was her brother and says that when she found him outside she would kiss him and not be despised. We in this world are despised, but it's because of whom we follow, Christ. She says that she would lead Solomon to her mother's house and she would instruct her. She would cause Solomon to drink of spiced wine of the juice of her pomegranate. Remember when Christ said that he would no longer drink wine until he drank new wine in heaven? She would have his left hand under her head and his right embracing her. This is a form of love that both comforts and holds close, offering comfortable rest and offering the comfort of closeness and protection. She charges the daughters of Jerusalem to not stir up or wake Solomon until he pleases. They do not determine the times for things. The chapter goes on to ask who comes up from the wilderness leaning on her beloved. Someone says that they raised her up under the apple tree, and that's where the mother brought them forth. I believe this is Solomon talking to the Shulamite, but notice that he raised her up under the apple tree where her mother brought her forth. Notice the messianic picture here of Christ raising up the church from where its mother, the Jews, brought her forth. After all, who would believe that Solomon raised up his bride under an apple tree where her mother brought her forth? Further, I believe this next part is speaking again. Is her speaking again. She says to set her as a seal on Solomon's heart, as a seal on his arm, because love is as strong as death and jealousy is as cruel as the grave. She says the coals are coals of fire with the most vehement flame. This is how much the love within her burns, and how much she wants it to burn within him. Fire is one of the pictures of the Holy Spirit coming down on the church, and is also found in Jeremiah's book as the message of God feeling like fire shut up in the bones. She says, many waters can't quench love, nor can floods drown it. If a man would give everything he has for love, it would be utterly contemned. Nothing can truly buy or sell love, and nothing can put out the power of love. Notice that the narrative talks about someone being a little sister who doesn't look like a woman, and someone asks what will be done for her when she shall be spoken for. They say that if she was a wall, they will build on her a palace of silver, and if a door, they will enclose her with boards of cedar. Then the Shulamite woman answers that she is a wall, and part of her is like towers. She is in Solomon's eyes as one that has found favor. We see the growth of the church from a small child to a beautiful bride ready for her husband. Then we see that it is that says that Solomon had a vineyard in Baal Hamon, where he let out to keepers. They were all to bring him 1,000 pieces of silver for their fruit. She then says that her vineyard, which is her own, is before her. Solomon must have 1,000, and those who keep the fruit of them 200. Those who dwell in the gardens, the companions, hear his voice, and she says to cause her to hear it. This brings us to a parable that Christ used involving the vineyards. The parable had God setting a vineyard, or the Jewish people, over which he put vine dressers, which are a picture of the religious officials of Christ's time, and even before. They killed those that were prophets, sent to bring out God's due fruit, and then they chose to kill his son, who was sent after the prophets. Christ said that God would destroy these wicked men and let out the vineyard to others. The final word of this chapter is, "Make haste, my beloved, and be thou like to a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of spices." Maranatha. Even so, come Lord Jesus. Amen. I want to thank you for joining us again today to talk about what was supposed to be one video, but I made two. This one was about Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. The last one was about Job chapters 32 through 42. I want to thank you all again for joining me. I hope you got something of value out of this, and I hope that God blesses you all in every way in Jesus' name.